Ok, and we're live. Hola amigos de Lemas, estamos hoy con Terri Cole, autora del libro Boundary Boss, que en español es ay, experta en límites, y hoy vamos a platicar un poco de este tema tan interesante. Hi Terry, thanks for being here with us.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited.
So, boundaries. It's a really hard topic for so many people, like
Mm,
putting them and talking about it and just like dealing with them, especially in a time with like we were raised to put no boundaries, and you talk about it in your book.
mhm.
Something that I love about the book is that it's dedicated to women in general because we suffer more from not putting boundaries. So, what would you say is like the biggest challenge for women in putting boundaries and like the difference between the roles between women and men, how we grow up, and why it's more difficult for us?
Mm. Well, why don't we start with what it is, what boundaries are? Because I
Sure.
think then we can all be on the same page because I think it's
Yeah.
confusing. So it's basically you knowing your preferences, your desires, your limits, and your deal breakers, and then having the ability to communicate them in your relationships. Got it?
Great. Yeah.
Yeah. So why don't we know how to do it? And how do the gender roles and family of origin impact that? Is the question. As women in particular, most of us were raised and praised to be self abandoning codependents. This is just cultural, where I don't care what country you grew up in, because I have had women from over 200 countries take my boundary courses, and nobody ever said, "Oh, yeah, I learned about this at home." They don't. Because when we look at the society, what is the expectation of little girls? Be a good girl, turn that frown around. If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. We were taught to be compliant, be pleasant, care about what other people feel and think, be self sacrificing. This was very socially sanctioned. We got approval for being self sacrificing and for being helpful, being a good girl. We did not get approval for asserting ourselves, especially if we wanted something different than the rest of the group or if we were going up against something in our family of origin. And we learned by what we saw, right? Most of us had behavior modeled for us of disordered boundaries. Women in particular, overgiving, overdoing, overfunctioning, saying yes when you really want to say no under the umbrella of being nice.
That's so hard to hear because it's so true. Like, no matter where you grow up, women are always raised the same, and this like people pleasing syndrome you talk about, right?
Yep.
So, in this road to be in the beginning to put like these boundaries, what would you say to women that are starting to put these boundaries, and what do you think are the most common mistakes in that road?
I think that the easiest thing is to figure out where you need boundaries because this is the confusion. People will get overwhelmed and be like, I don't even know where I need them. We're going to take a quick resentment inventory. So, this is writing down who are you holding resentment for and why. So, let's say I feel resentful. Share this story in the book. I feel resentful of my sister because she comes into my apartment and she takes my clothes without asking me. She borrows something. So then I'm looking for that thing, but I don't know that she has it. So I think that thing is lost. So I'm resentful. So what would I do? I write that down. Now I have to look and say, what is my 50% of that interaction? I haven't said anything to her yet. That's one thing. And I need to talk to her about it. So then I make a plan, right? I make a plan to have a boundary conversation with her and say, I would like to make a simple request that if you want to keep your keys to my apartment, that you will ask me before you take my stuff. Maybe she does, maybe she doesn't, but at least I'm setting the boundary. I'm making the request and I'm giving her a chance to respect my wish. So the I think the resentment inventory is a great place to start because it'll act like a GPS to get people to what relationships might need their attention. But the second thing I would say to people sort of starting down this path of wanting to have healthier, better boundaries is we have to buy time. Meaning, if you're someone who's a bit of an auto yes person, meaning people ask you to do stuff and you don't even think, you just are like, okay. Again, people pleasing, right? That I'm going to ask you to do an experiment and for 7 days commit to no automatic yes to anything. So instead of that, we learn to buy time. So if someone says, oh, hi, do you want to go to a concert on Saturday? And you don't want to, instead of saying yes, because here's the thing, when we say yes, when we really want to say no, it makes it so much harder to go back and say no. Or we do the thing and we do it resentfully. We blame the other person. Why are they asking me to go to a concert that starts so late? What the hell is wrong with them? Right? We don't take it on ourselves. So what does it look like to buy time? It looks like you saying, I need to check with my partner to see if I'm free. I'll let you know tomorrow. Or I have a 24-hour decision-making policy. So I'll let you know tomorrow. And we could do it like with a joke, like I have a 24-hour decision-making policy for my sanity. So I'll let you know tomorrow. And what we're doing is that we are retraining people because we have trained people to expect an instant response from us, an instant text back, that we will always pick up the phone when they call. We have trained them. So when you have healthier boundaries, if you don't want to continue to do that, we have to retrain the people in our lives to do something different. So when you buy time and say, I'll let you know tomorrow, it's 100% easier to go back and say, oh, I checked with my roommate or my sister, whatever it is, and we actually have other plans, so I can't do it, but thank you for thinking of me. And we can always start with sweetness, right? If we have to say no to someone, but it's someone we care about, someone we like, we can always say, I really appreciate that you always think about me or that you always think to include me, but I actually can't go this Wednesday because I have other plans. But really, thank you for thinking of me. Like it doesn't have to be mean or bad or harsh. And I think there's a lot of myths around setting boundaries that if you get good at setting boundaries, then you're going to become a mean person.
You talk about this a lot in your book, and I want you to tell me about the difference between like people say like, oh no, I'm an empath, and that's why I try to do all this stuff for people, and the line between being a truly empath person and then
Mhm.
being a people pleaser.
Yeah. Well, these things, honestly, I can say from being a recovering people pleaser and an active empath, that these two things really go together because we've already been trained to be pleasant and to be accommodating to other people, that's considered good as women. So now you add being an empath. So for people who don't know what that is, a lot of people probably do, but I'll just explain it just in case. It means that you actually feel other people's feelings. It's not the same as being sympathetic. Sympathetic is like I can imagine how you feel and I feel bad for that or I feel I have compassion for you. Being an empath means that we actually feel the other person's feelings. So when I walk into a room, whoever is, if somebody is in pain, I will feel that in my own body. It's like way more than being just dialed in to other people. And you have to learn how to take care of your energy when you're an empath. Because if not, you're like a house with no door where everything can come in. You know what I mean? So I do energy work, like, and this is stuff that I don't really talk about that much because it sounds, might sound weird to people, like, what is energy work? But there's a way of zipping up your energy and of clearing your energy and I take a bath and use different types of things that I put in the bath that clears the energy of my day. Being an empath, because I interact with a lot of people, whether it's millions of people online, like that's a lot of energy coming at you, or just seeing therapy clients or whatever it is. So to answer your question, which I didn't, but I will, the difference between being an empath and having disordered boundaries or being a codependent, these things are like comparing apples and oranges, because most people who have disordered boundaries, a lot of times, especially if your boundaries are too porous, meaning they're too malleable, they're too weak, you're probably an empath, because that really goes together. Now, there are other ways that boundaries can be disordered. You could have rigid boundaries. So let's just talk a little bit about that. The types of boundaries that we can have, meaning you can have too porous, they're just called porous boundaries, meaning they're too loose. You can have rigid boundaries, meaning they're too tight, they're too firm, you're too like that, And then, of course, the third one is healthy boundaries, and that's what we want. So I actually have a quiz that people can take, a free quiz. It's just boundaryquiz.com. And that will help you. There's like 7 archetypes, and that will help you figure out how does your disordered boundaries show up in your life? Because there's the misunderstanding. People think if you are really a boundary boss, then you're like telling everybody what to do, and you're like, it's my way or the highway, buddy. And that's not true. If you're acting like that, you have rigid boundaries. Because if you're a boundary boss, you are flexible, meaning you can make a simple request and you can accept someone else's boundaries if they say no, right? Because when you have rigid boundaries and someone says no to you, and even if you have porous boundaries, you could get very upset about that. Where when you have healthy boundaries, you understand that people have a right to be sovereign, right? To be self-determined. And maybe they don't want to do the thing you want them to do. And that doesn't mean they don't love you. And it doesn't mean you're not going to have a relationship with them.
That's great. And I also think that as we evolve, our boundaries evolve. So
Yes.
how often would you recommend like us taking that quiz or working on the exercises that are in the book to know if we're becoming too rigid or too flexible? Like how do you know when it's time to change your boundaries?
I really think it's how you feel. How you feel inside is how you know. Because if there is something off with your boundaries, you're going to be upset, hurt, pissed. You're going to be resentful. And so we need to really look at why you feel the way you do. We need to start to become radically curious, right? So, not judgmental, right? But radically curious about how you are feeling. When you leave an interaction with someone, a friend, let's say, do you feel energized? Do you feel burdened? Do you feel drained? Is it like the friend who just complains and complains and complains, and you leave and you're just like, oh, I'm exhausted? We need to really do an inventory of who is in our life. And in the beginning of the book, I have a whole list that you do called the okay and not okay list in all areas of your life, from the smallest things to the biggest things. Because I think that a lot of times we don't think about what we're tolerating. A lot of times we're putting up with more than we should be. And we're just not even aware of it. We're sort of like, this is just life. I'm just going to get up and go through the day and drop and do it all over again. So the book, Boundary Boss, is an invitation for you to slow down and for you to really look at Like, what am I tolerating? Are people treating me the way I want to be treated? Am I doing the work that I want to be doing, or am I, or my relationships the way I want them to be? And it can be something as small as, I had this office in my house and I had this light that I hated. It was this overhead light and it was super bright and gross and like I just couldn't stand it. And every time I flipped it on, I was like, ugh, I hate this light. And I remember telling my husband, and he was like, let's just get a floor lamp, Terri. You don't need to keep that light. And he took the light down and covered up the hole and got me a beautiful floor lamp. And just that change, just that small change is something that I could do to not tolerate something that was bothering me. And I think as empaths, a lot of time we feel like, oh, I don't want to make a big deal out of nothing. I don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill. I don't want to be a troublemaker. But there are so many things that we are tolerating that we could change ourselves and be so much more satisfied in our lives.
I love that. I also love that you talk about your husband and your relationship in the book a lot. And
Mhm.
I feel like setting boundaries at the beginning of a relationship is really hard. Like, especially at the beginning when you're just trying to like him and you like be the best version of yourself and be like this perfect
Yeah.
version, every single detail is thought about. So how would you recommend like bringing the boundaries talk into the relationship?
Well, what we're really saying, I think you have to talk early and often. And I don't think we have to talk about boundaries per se. What we have to do is assert ourselves honestly. If someone says to you, you're dating, and they say, I'll call you Friday and let's go out Friday night. This is on Wednesday. And then Friday, they never call and you don't see them. And then they call you Monday or text you Monday and they're like, what's up? They don't mention it, they don't say anything. You have a choice. If you're going to be a boundary boss, you're going to say, oh, when I didn't hear from you on Friday, I figured you got caught up. I ended up going out with my girlfriends. How was your weekend? Right? If you still want to give this person a chance. If you don't say anything and you just act normal, you are literally colluding with that behavior. You are agreeing to that behavior. So those are the boundaries that I'm talking about. If you are, it's the beginning of a relationship, and let's say this person wants to get sexual too fast, or they want to text, I don't even know what it's called because I'm so old, but sexting or whatever it is that people do. But if that's not your thing, or you don't like that, or that feels disrespectful, then don't participate and say, hey, 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 it's a little early for this, buddy. You could be funny. We could do it with a joke, but protect yourself, right? If you're dating and they pick a restaurant, but it's far for you and close to where they live, instead of agreeing to that, say, hey, you know what? I'm going to be going home kind of late. I would rather we meet somewhere in between or closer to my apartment, please. Right? We have to assert our preferences because remember what your boundaries are: your preferences, your desires, your deal breakers, right? Your limits. These are what your boundaries are. And they don't just make up your boundaries, they also make up who you are in life. So your preferences matter. And I feel like many of
Mm,
us as people pleasers were taught that if you had a preference, you were like extra, you were like too much, you were like a pain. And I'm going to say, I disagree.
I love that. And I love that you brought up like the texting and like sexting and everything, because I feel like social media is now a really big part of our lives, and especially like texting and everything. So
Mhm.
throughout your career, have you noticed any shifts in how people handle their boundaries, especially with this rise of social media?
Okay, yeah, I sure have. Because in back in the day, before there was online dating and social media, you had to deal with people, right? The ghosting was barely a thing. because you were going to see that person at church or at the grocery store, or it's like your friend's cousin. Like you can't just be like, hey, I'm just never responding to you ever again. What ends up happening in because of the availability in the online world is that the civility, the rules of engagement, the respectful rules of engagement have changed. And even we see this, of course, with the trolls online as well. People have what I call cyber balls because they would never have the courage to say that crap to your face.
Right.
Never in real life. These are like the keyboard warriors. So in one way, I think that it's harder because you really have to try to vet people in the dating world, you know, before you see them. It's like trying to really figure out because there's also a lot of scams out there. There's a lot of people trying to get money from people and pretending that they're, you know what I mean? So I feel like in a way we have to be a little bit more paranoid, but we also have to be more boundaried because that protects you too. And when you think about if you talk about your preferences early and often in your dating life, you will spare yourself a whole bunch of bull stuff later, a whole bunch of pain later. So I know what you mean. Like we want to have our best foot forward, but what I would like people to think about it as is we want to have the truth forward. It's not just the best version of ourselves, because then we act like all these things are okay. But once you get comfortable in a relationship, you'll realize, wow, I created a monster. Like
Yeah.
there's no boundaries and I'm exhausted and I feel taken advantage of. And yet we set it up that way by not having good boundaries in the beginning, you know?
Yeah. And apart from romantic relationships, I feel like one of the aspects where it's harder to put boundaries is in the family relationships. And especially with the holidays coming up, how do you deal
Yep.
with setting boundaries in your family in like a compassionate way and then starting like a really big drama on Thanksgiving dinner?
Yep. Yeah, let's not do it at Thanksgiving dinner. Um, I think that, I actually write quite a bit about this because my therapy clients would all be like complaining about it. So the first thing I want you to do is before the holidays even come, because they haven't come yet, is you're going to do an inventory of all the things you normally do over the holidays. And you're going to really take a look at that. And you're going to really look at whether you want to do those things. Like, are you just doing it because it's what you always do? Have you outgrown those friends and you don't even know why you meet up with them and have like a bad time or whatever it is? So be really discerning about how you spend your time throughout the holidays. You can have rules of engagement. So let's just say if it were someone who lived in the US and you are, I mean, this happened. I mean, there's been so much division because of politics, which obviously we're not going to get into, but in family systems, the way that I've survived is we don't talk about politics. And there has to be a rule. And, I have like people in my family who try to provoke me into it, and they know they can't. I just say to, an uncle or whoever it is, trying to stir the pot. So for me, I become unprovocable, right? I just decide I don't spend that much time with these people. I'm not, I'm not going to change this guy's mind politically. So let's not ruin the dinner. So I think it's okay to have those boundaries. And I think you need to have boundaries that say, I don't want to, I don't talk about politics or whatever it is, because it doesn't have to be politics, but what if people are asking intrusive questions? Right. Oh, when did you and your boyfriend break up? Oh, I heard you got divorced. Oh, I heard you had a miscarriage. I mean, like people will ask you the most messed up things, like no problem. So I think that you can either say, I'm not interested in talking about that, thank you. Or you can say, why would you want to know that? Which a lot of times will have the person retract the
Yeah.
question where they're like, oh, okay, fine. Or how would that help you to know that? Because it's really just morbid curiosity so much of the time. And you're like, your morbid curiosity is definitely not my problem for sure. But I think that going in with realistic expectations is also helpful. If you're parent is always this way or your sister is always this way. Let's not go into Thanksgiving thinking that they suddenly got a lobotomy and they're going to be different. They're probably going to be the same way they've been for the last however old you are Thanksgivings. So decide how much time you want to spend there. I will always, if I'm going somewhere that I don't want to spend a lot of time, but I feel obligated to go, I'll always say, oh, I have another gathering I have to go to, even if it's not true. I don't care, right? It's okay. Whatever, any means necessary of how you've got to protect your own boundaries and mental health. So I'll either warn my friend or my aunt, you know, actually, so Vic and I will be leaving at 8 because we've got somewhere else to go. And then I leave, right? But I don't overstay my welcome in a situation where I feel like it's going to get explosive, you know?
Yeah, that's great. I love the part about being like unprovocable. I feel like I gotta work through that, especially with my family. And also, like, apart from being a provocable person and not assertive, what would you say are the most common mistakes in the path to putting boundaries?
Oh, let's see. I think that people misunderstand the point of doing it.
Mm,
So I think that we have to get clear that having a boundary conversation, asserting yourself is for you and your healing and your mental health and your self-esteem comes from doing that. It's not about what the other person does. So if the other person doesn't agree, gets mad, whatever, that doesn't mean that you failed. You still will get the benefit of asserting yourself because that is where your healing is. It's in the silence. It's the silently suffering. It's the silently seething, being angry but not saying anything, talking badly about that person to someone else. All of that stuff is bad for your mental health. Having the courage to assert yourself and realize that the earth is not going to stop spinning on its axis because you say no to someone or because you disappoint someone. This is a part of life. And if we never disappoint others, trust me, we are disappointing ourselves because we are
mm,
self-abandoning if we are never disappointing others. And you're not that fragile, right? You're solid, you're okay. And most of your relationships are not that fragile either. We're just afraid that they are. It's the little kid in us that is afraid we're going to be rejected or left or kicked out of the pack. You know, it's like a primal fear. But you're really not that fragile. And if your relationship does blow up because you start to assert yourself, that relationship was built on your self-abandonment.
mm.
Trust me, it is not good for you.
Wow, that's like really important to hear. And finally, if you could only give one piece of advice to someone who is feeling overwhelmed about not knowing how to set boundaries in their life, what would it be?
Just start with figuring out where you need them and then buying time. So, which means start with the resentment inventory.
Mm,
Go do the boundaryquiz.com so you'll get information. I actually give you a video, I give you a downloadable exercise for your specific archetype. So it's actually a great quiz, boundaryquiz.com. So the two things, because I can't just say one, is do the resentment inventory. And then the second one is start practicing buying time when someone asks you to do something so that you can come back and give an honest no if that's what it is. And I walk you through that in the book, which you can get at boundarybossbook.com. I think that's what it is, but also it's sold everywhere. Everywhere books are sold, you can get the book as well. And I also have a podcast if people are interested in that, the Terri Cole Show.
oh, where can we find a podcast?
Just everywhere, anywhere you get your podcast, just search the Terri Cole Show. I've had it since 2015, and it's all
Wow,
just
that's a
like
long
this.
time. Yeah.
It's just mental health. It's I do 2 episodes a week. One, I interview someone, and it's all mental. It really is mental health and empowerment. Sometimes it's people like Leanne Rhymes or there's like celebrities as well. And then one is a solo episode, just me teaching you something about something to make your life better.
Thank you so much for having this talk with us and guiding us through putting boundaries and starting the road to becoming a boundary boss.
Why, thank you so much for having me, Jimena. I appreciate you.
It was so nice to talk to you. Y amigos de Limas, los esperamos en la próxima entrevista y corran a comprar el libro de Terry. Thank you.